They took my office first, then my parking spot, then my chair at the head of the table. Preston stood up in front of my own board. He said my thinking had gotten too slow for where the company was going. My daughter didn't look up from her coffee. They voted 6-1. I was the one, and I still had the patents on every machine in that building. Not one of them knew it. Then I picked up the phone. I called a woman in Pittsburgh. I hadn't needed her in 11 years. But before the phone call, there was the funeral. My name is Delbert Cutler. I am 74 years old. I did not raise my voice in that boardroom. I have never needed to. Preston stood at the head of the conference table. He told the board my thinking had gotten too slow for where this company is going. My own daughter did not look up from her coffee. I sat in the chair I'd sat in for 46 years. I let him finish his sentence. That's a habit from the shop floor. You let the machine finish its cut. You don't reach in early. You wait. You listen to the tone of it. Then you act. Preston Vance had married my daughter Joanne 12 years back. Good-looking fella. Talked fast. Wore a watch that cost more than my first lathe. I never held that against him. A man can dress how he wants. What I held against him was smaller than that. Colder too. He thought I was finished. He said it plain right at the table, in front of 6 people I'd hired myself. My daughter stirred her coffee, like the words hadn't landed anywhere near her. I'd built Cutler Precision Tool out of a rented garage, Furnace Street, Drayton Falls, Pennsylvania, 46 years before that morning. 1 lathe, 1 drill press, bought used from a mill that was closing. I ran it alone the first 2 years, then with 1 helper, then 5, then 42 people, all drawing a paycheck with my name at the bottom of it. We made precision fasteners for aerospace work. Tolerances so tight, you measure them in 10,000ths of an inch. Get that wrong once, on a bolt holding a wing spar together, and you don't get a second try at that reputation. I can still true up a warped fixture plate by ear. I don't mean I guess. I mean I listen to the tone the mill makes cutting into it. I can tell you before the gauge ever confirms it, whether that plate holds true under load or walks on you 3 parts in. I did that the week before the board meeting. Caught a batch of out-of-spec fasteners our new quality manager had signed off on. A kid Preston hired. Nobody said thank you. Preston said it made me look like I didn't trust his hires. I said I trusted the tolerance gauge more than anybody's feelings about it, mine included. I don't raise my voice. I check the tolerance. That's the whole of what I know how to do. It has never once let me down. Ruth used to tell me that was the only sermon I ever gave. She wasn't wrong. Ruth was my wife. 41 years. She kept this company's books by hand for 3 decades. Sat at a roll-top desk in the corner of the shop with a ledger and a mechanical pencil. She caught things no accountant with a computer ever caught. She knew every vendor's handwriting. She knew when a number felt wrong before she could tell you why. She died 3 years before that boardroom morning. Cancer. The kind that takes its time and then doesn't. I don't like to walk through the particulars. I'll only say this. The last clear week we had, she was propped up in the bed we'd bought new only 6 years before. She took my hand. She said, "Don't ever let anyone put their name on what your hand's made." I didn't fully understand that day. I understood it a lot better later, in a conference room, listening to my son-in-law explain that my thinking had slowed down. I want to tell you about the shop before I tell you about the theft. You need to know what 46 years of a man's hands looks like. Then you'll understand what it means to have somebody try to take it in an afternoon. Cutler Precision Tool sits on Furnace Street, half a mile from the old rail spur. Coal used to come through this valley on that spur, before the mines closed and the town shrank to about 6,000 people. Most of them worked for us, or the hospital, or the school district. I started that company in 1980, $1,100 of savings, and a lathe I bought at an estate auction for 450 of it. Ruth was pregnant with our son Randall that year. We didn't have much of a plan beyond not starving. I worked the counter of a hardware store during the day the first year. Ran the lathe at night. Small jobs, custom fittings, one-off parts for the mill up the road, whatever paid. By 1985, I had my first employee. By 1995, I had a real building, the one still standing on Furnace Street today, purchased for $62,000. Felt like the entire moon to me back then. By 2005, we'd landed our first aerospace supplier contract, titanium fasteners for a company building parts for regional jets. That contract alone was worth $400,000 a year to us at its peak. By the time Preston stood up in that boardroom, Cutler Precision Tool was worth, on paper, somewhere around $11 million. 42 employees, a building free and clear, equipment that would cost $3 million to replace today. All of it traced back to a $450 lathe, and a woman who believed in me before there was any reason to. I handed the daily running of the company to my son Randall 8 years before that morning. I was 66. My knees had started arguing with me about standing on concrete floors 10 hours a day. Randall had gone to engineering school. Unlike me, he understood modern quality systems and computer scheduling in a way I never bothered to learn. I stayed on as a board member. I stayed on paper, as the majority holder of every patent this company ran on. 7 of them. Fixture designs, tooling geometries. A coating process we developed in-house that let us hold tolerance on titanium longer than any competitor within 400 miles. I didn't stay on because I didn't trust Randall. I stayed on because Ruth asked me to, in her own quiet way, more than once, long before she got sick. "Keep your name on the drawings, Delbert," she used to say. "The machines can run without you. The drawings can't run without somebody minding them." I didn't fully understand what she meant until 11 years before that boardroom morning. A supplier dispute nearly cost us the company. A subcontractor claimed he'd co-developed one of our coating processes, tried to walk off with it to a competitor, tried to argue in front of a judge that the property was joint. We won that fight. It cost us $60,000 in legal fees, 8 months of sleepless nights. It taught me something Ruth had already understood without a law degree. A company is not the building. A company is not even the people. A company, stripped down, is a handful of ideas. Ideas worth more than the sum of the steel around them. And ideas need an owner, a name written down somewhere solid, somewhere nobody thinks to look. So I went to see a woman named Marion Attaway, patent attorney, small office on Grant Street in Pittsburgh, about an hour and 10 minutes from Drayton Falls if the turnpike's moving. She'd handled filing work for me since the late 80s. I told her what had almost happened with the subcontractor. She told me, in that flat, careful voice lawyers use right before something important, that the company holding its own patents outright was a convenience, not a necessity. Conveniences, she said, can be exploited by anybody who ends up controlling the company later. I asked her what the alternative looked like. She told me. I listened. I said, do it. We formed a private holding entity that year, the Ruth Cutler Furnace Street IP Trust, named for my wife, at Marion's suggestion, since Ruth was the one who'd said the words that started the whole idea. All 7 of my core tooling patents got re-recorded into that trust, one by one, me as sole trustee. Cutler Precision Tool kept only a revocable license to use them, not ownership. A license, the kind of thing a board can vote to change 100 details about and never once touch, because it was never theirs to touch in the first place. I told nobody but Ruth and Marion. Not Randall. Not, obviously, a son-in-law who hadn't even met my daughter yet. I wasn't hiding it out of spite. I was hiding it the way you don't tell a man crossing a frozen pond exactly how thick the ice is. Some knowledge only matters to the one who needs it. Preston Vance came into the picture 6 years before that boardroom morning when he married Joanne. He'd worked in finance somewhere in Philadelphia. Commercial lending, something like that. Never explained it clearly. I never asked twice. Randall brought him in as chief financial officer a year after the wedding, at Joanne's urging. I didn't object at the time. Family businesses bring in family, that's not a sin. It's a risk you take with your eyes open. Same as running a lathe with a warped chuck. You know it can throw apart. You run it anyway, because the alternative is not running a tool. For the first 4 years, Preston did fine work. I'll say that plainly. Fairness cost me nothing. He tightened our receivables. He renegotiated a supplier contract that saved us $18,000 a year. I started to think the risk had paid off clean. Then, about 2 years before the boardroom morning, something in him changed. Small things first. He started calling me a legacy vote at company dinners, laughing when he said it, like it was only a joke. He moved my office, the one I'd had since 1995, down the hall into what had been a supply closet, called it temporary, while we redo the executive wing. That redo never once got scheduled. He started booking board meetings on days he knew I had doctor's appointments. Apologised for the oversight afterward. None of it was a crime. All of it was a message. The message was, "You're becoming furniture in this building, Delbert. And furniture doesn't get consulted." I didn't say much. Here's why. Some of it was patience. The same patience I use waiting on a mill to finish a cut. But some of it was Joanne, my daughter. I watched her watch Preston do these things to me. I watched her go quiet every time. The same quiet she went that morning over her coffee. I told myself she was caught in the middle. I told myself a lot of things so I wouldn't have to look straight at what was happening. My own daughter had decided, somewhere along the way, that keeping the peace with her husband mattered more than defending her father's chair. A chair he'd built with his own hands. Preston's real trouble, the trouble underneath all the little moves, I didn't learn until later. I want to tell it to you the way I learned it. In pieces. That's the truth of how it happened. What I knew the morning of the vote was almost nothing. I knew he'd started a side venture about 18 months earlier. Some kind of specialty coatings company. Separate from Cutler Precision entirely. He talked about it at family dinners like it was already a rocket ship. I knew Joanne had put in some money of her own. $20,000, she told me once, offhand. Like it was nothing. I did not know that morning how much deeper it went. I found that out from Sully. Sully Doyle had run our shop floor for 30 years. Started the same year, I hired my second full-time man. Sully didn't talk much. He didn't miss much either. Those two things together made him worth more to me than any consultant I ever paid for. He was standing in the back of that boardroom the morning Preston fired me. Sully always stood in the back of everything, arms crossed, reading the room the way he read a machine. He told me afterward, quiet in the parking lot, that Preston had looked relieved walking out of there. Not victorious. Relieved. Like a man who'd just made a payment he was scared he couldn't make. I filed that word away. Relieved. A man doesn't look relieved firing his father-in-law over a business disagreement. A man looks relieved when a debt he's been carrying gets a little lighter. I didn't know yet what debt Preston was carrying. I only knew there was one, and that it was bigger than anybody at that table had said out loud. That morning before the vote, Preston walked me through his reasoning like he was doing me a kindness. He said the board needed fresh thinking to close the coming licensing opportunity. He said my seat had become a legacy vote that slows consensus. He never once mentioned patents by name. He never once asked who actually owned the tooling designs running every machine on that floor. That struck me, even in the moment, as strange. A man about to fire the founder of a precision tooling company might check what the founder still holds the rights to. Preston didn't check. I don't know if that was arrogance or carelessness. Either one told me something. He believed the company owned everything inside its own walls, simply because it sat inside those walls. That's a mistake a smart man makes exactly once. I voted no on myself when they called it. That's not sentiment. That's procedure. You vote your own interest and let the numbers fall where they fall. 6 votes to 1. Randall voted yes. He didn't look at me either. Same as his sister. I understood, in that moment, that Preston's quiet campaign hadn't run against me alone. He'd run it against my own children too, patient and steady. The way you wear down a bearing until it finally seizes. I stood up. I shook no one's hand, because no one offered one. I walked out past the floor, where I'd trued up 10,000 fixture plates over 4.5 decades, past Sully, who caught my eye and gave one short nod. The kind of nod one tradesman gives another when a job's gone bad and there's nothing left to say about it. I got in my truck. I did not go home. I drove to the cemetery first. I do that more than I tell people. Ruth Stone sits under an oak tree on the north side. I picked that plot because she liked morning shade better than afternoon sun. I stood there a long while. I told her what had happened, out loud the way I still do. 41 years of talking to a woman doesn't just stop because she's gone. I told her Preston called me too slow. I told her our son hadn't looked up either. And I told her finally the thing I'd been sitting on for 11 years. The machines can run without me, Ruth. The drawings can't. Then I got back in the truck. I drove to the office on Grant Street in Pittsburgh. There's a kind of grief that only sitting still makes worse. There was work now. Real work. The kind I understood. I intended to do it the way I'd done everything else in my life. Quiet. Exact. To tolerance. Marion Attaway had been expecting a call from me eventually, not that day specifically, but eventually. She'd told me, 11 years earlier, that a day might come when somebody inside my own company decided the license was theirs to trade away, without understanding it was only ever a license, never the thing itself. She'd been right about a great many things over the years. I sat down across from her desk, same chair I'd sat in over a decade before. I told her what Preston had said in that boardroom. She listened the way she always listens, without interrupting. Taking a note here and there in handwriting I've never once been able to read. When I finished, she opened a drawer, pulled a thin folder, set it on the desk between us. The Federal Registry filings? 7 patents. Everyone assigned 11 years earlier to the Ruth Cutler Furnace Street IP Trust. Sole trustee, Delbert J. Cutler. Not one line mentioned Cutler Precision Tool as an owner of anything, only as a licensee, a revocable one. They fired the trustee, Marion said quiet, the way she says everything. Not the trust. Sit with that sentence a minute. It's the whole shape of what happened next. Neither of us knew yet exactly how it would land, or when, or in front of how many people. Preston thought he'd removed an old man from a board seat. What he'd actually done was cut the one string holding the whole company's future together. And he hadn't even looked to see it was there. I asked Marion one question before I left that day. I asked what happened to the company's licensing rights, if the license itself contained a clause tying it to my board membership. A clause she'd written into the original assignment 11 years earlier as routine caution. She smiled just barely. The way a person smiles when they already know the answer matters more than the question realises. She pulled the original agreement, turned it around so I could read it myself. There it was, Section 4. Buried in language only a patent lawyer reads twice. The licence terminates automatically upon the removal of Delbert J. Cutler from the company's board of directors for any reason other than voluntary resignation submitted in writing by the trustee. They'd voted me off that morning. Not asked me to resign. Voted. I sat in that office a long moment. I didn't feel joy exactly. I felt something closer to what I feel when a part comes off the mill, dead true, after a long, hard run. A settled quiet. The sense of a thing finally being correct after a stretch of being wrong. I told Marion I wasn't ready to move on anything yet. I wanted to understand what Preston actually needed that licensing deal for, and why before I let a single piece of paper move. She agreed. She always agreed with patience over speed. It's why I'd kept her 18 years. I drove home to the house Ruth and I built together in 1998. Her garden still out back. Tomatoes and marigolds she'd planted the spring before she died. That I'd kept alive out of something between habit and stubbornness. I sat on the porch a long while that evening. I did not call Randall. I did not call Joanne. I called nobody at all. I just sat, the way you sit after a long shift, letting your hands remember what they'd done all day, waiting to see what the next day would ask of them. I want to tell you, plainly, what I did not do. I did not raise my voice at that boardroom table. I did not raise it after either, not to Preston, not to Randall, not to Joanne. I have never in my life put a hand on another man in anger. I did not start that year. What I did was quieter than that. Slower too. By the time it was finished, it did more damage to Preston Vance's life than any shouting match ever could have. But that part comes later. First, you need to understand what Preston was hiding, and how close he'd already come, without knowing it, to betting his whole future on drawings that had never belonged to him. I didn't go looking for Preston's secrets. I want that understood. I'm not a man who digs through other men's mail. What happened was, 3 days after the vote, I drove back to the shop anyway. Not to work. I still had a board seat technically, and a board seat gets you a parking spot even when nobody wants you using it. I parked at the far end of the lot, near the loading dock. Out of habit more than plan. I sat there a minute finishing a cup of coffee before going in to clean out my desk. That's when I heard Preston's voice, raised, coming from behind a panel truck 2 spots over. He hadn't seen my truck. I wasn't hiding. I just happened to be sitting still. Stillness makes a man invisible, in a way moving never does. I told you the money's coming, Preston was saying. Low and fast. The voice of a man trying to sound calm and missing it by a wide margin. 6 weeks. Maybe 8. I've got a licensing deal closing that solves this whole thing. A pause. Somebody on the other end said something I couldn't hear. Preston's voice cracked a little on the next line. Don't call the house again. My wife doesn't need to hear this. He hung up hard enough that I heard the phone hit the truck's hood. Then he stood there a second, both hands flat on the hood, head down, like a man bracing for a hit that hadn't landed yet. I sat in my own truck and finished my coffee. I didn't make a sound. When he finally walked in through the side door, I gave it another 5 minutes before I followed. I didn't know the number he'd called. I didn't know who was on the other end. I didn't need to. Not that day. I only needed the shape of it. A man doesn't beg a caller not to phone his own house, unless the caller already has the number and has already used it. A man doesn't promise a licensing deal will solve this whole thing, unless the whole thing is bigger than a board seat. I'd built machines my whole life. I know the sound a system makes right before it fails. That phone call was the sound. I went in and cleaned out my desk. 46 years leaves surprisingly little behind. A photograph of Ruth at the company's 10th anniversary, standing in front of the old sign. A coffee mug Randall made me in 8th grade shop class. Glaze cracked, handle crooked. The ugliest and most valuable object I owned. A drawer of pencils worn to stubs because I never once threw away a pencil that could still hold a point. I put it all in one box. Sully carried it to my truck without being asked. Neither of us said a word about the boardroom the whole walk across the lot. I called Marion that evening, told her what I'd overheard. She didn't tell me to do anything with it yet. Facts first, she said. Then leverage. Never the other order. I liked that about her. In 18 years, she never once told me to move faster than the facts allowed. Over the following weeks, I kept my distance from the company. Not from my family, mostly. Joanne called twice. Both times she talked around the vote instead of about it. Told me about her son Danny's soccer schedule. Asked if I wanted to come to his game. Never once mentioned that her husband had stood up and called her father's mind too slow in front of 6 people. I went to the soccer game, sat 2 rows behind Preston and Joanne on those cold aluminum bleachers. Watched my grandson score a goal. Afterward, Preston shook my hand like nothing had happened. I let him. That's a small price, shaking a man's hand, when you already know what his hand is worth. Randall called once. He didn't apologise exactly. Said he thought the vote was the right business decision. Said he hoped I understood it wasn't personal. I told him I understood. That part was true. It wasn't personal to Randall. It was personal to me. There's a difference. I didn't think my son had learned it yet. I hoped someday he would. 3 weeks after the vote, Joanne invited me to Sunday dinner. The big colonial on Larchmont Drive that Preston had bought 4 years back. Columns out front. Always a little much for a street where every other house sat modest and plain. I almost said no. I went instead. Partly because I missed my grandson. Partly because I wanted to watch Preston a while longer. The way you watch a machine running rough before you decide where the problem sits. Dinner was pot roast, Joanne's recipe, learned from her mother. It was good. I told her so. She smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her in weeks. Danny talked about school. Preston talked about the company in careful, broad strokes. The kind a man uses when he's decided ahead of time what he will and won't say. I let most of it pass. Then, over coffee, I asked him, plain and easy, how the coatings venture was coming along. The one he'd started on the side. Preston's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Just a fraction of a second. If you weren't looking for it, you'd have missed it. I was looking for it. I caught it clean. It's coming along fine, he said. Too quickly. Too smooth. Words arriving before the thought behind them finished forming. Slower than I'd like. These things take capital nobody warns you about. He laughed, a short laugh with no air behind it, and changed the subject to Danny's report card. Joanne didn't notice anything wrong. She'd stopped noticing things about Preston a while back, I think. The way you stop noticing a clock ticking in a room you've lived in for years. I didn't push it further that night. You don't lean on a fixture already showing stress. You note where the stress is. You come back to it later, with the right tool, at the right moment. I finished my coffee, thanked Joanne, hugged my grandson and drove home in the dark, thinking about the sound of Preston's voice in that parking lot, and the sound of his fork stopping over pot roast. Those 2 sounds together told me more than any balance sheet could have. The following week Sully called, which he almost never did. Sully wasn't a man who calls if a nod in passing will do the job. He'd overheard 2 of the younger guys in the machine shop talking. The kind of talk that spreads through a floor faster than any memo. Preston had already promised somebody, some outside lender, that the Cutler licensing deal would close within 2 months and cover a shortfall. Sully didn't know the exact number. He knew the word shortfall had been used, more than once to more than one person, like a man rehearsing a lie until it started to sound true to himself. That was the moment the whole shape of it clicked for me. Preston wasn't simply modernising the board or clearing out dead weight, or any of the polite words he'd used in that conference room. Preston was drowning in debt from his own coatings venture, debt big enough that he'd promised a lender money from a licensing deal that didn't exist yet, using patents he didn't actually control, patents he apparently didn't even know he didn't control. He had bet his own financial survival on a deal he assumed would fall into his lap once the old man was out of the way. He was standing on a beam he hadn't checked, and I was the only man alive who knew, with total certainty, exactly how much weight that beam could take before it gave. I called Marion the next morning, told her everything Sully had passed along. She went quiet a moment on the line, the kind of quiet that means she's doing arithmetic in her head, legal arithmetic, the kind that doesn't show its work until it's ready. I want to see whatever loan documents exist, she said finally. If he's personally guaranteed something against that house, against his own assets, we need the number before we know the next move. Over the following 2 weeks, I learned the actual shape of what Preston had done. Through channels I won't bore you with, channels that involved a title search Marion ran herself, and a conversation Sully had, careful and roundabout, with a cousin of his at a bank branch in Altoona. Preston had personally guaranteed a loan of $290,000 against his own house to cover the failed coatings venture, a business that had burned through nearly $400,000 of investment in under 2 years without landing a single sustainable customer. The note came due in 9 weeks. If Preston couldn't cover it or refinance it, the bank would move on the house. His house, my daughter's house, my grandson's house. And Preston, desperate, cornered, had already told the coatings lender, in writing, that an upcoming licensing deal would close within the quarter and cover the shortfall entirely. A licensing deal for Patent's Cutler precision tool did not in fact own. A licensing deal that could not legally close at all, not the way he'd promised it. The moment he voted his own father-in-law off that board, he'd triggered a clause that ended the company's right to license those patents to anybody. I sat with that knowledge a long while before I did anything with it. Here's the truth about me, and see, I did not build a company for 46 years by moving fast when careful would serve better. I did not want revenge. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that feels good for an afternoon and costs you something you can't get back. I wanted the truth laid out plain, on a table, in front of the people who needed to see it. At the one moment it would matter most, that takes patience. That takes timing. By then I had both, along with something Preston didn't have at all. The actual paper proving every word he'd promised his lender was worth exactly nothing. There was one more thing I needed before I could sit back and wait for the timing to be right. It wasn't a legal thing. It was personal, and it lived inside the shop itself, in a place Preston had already decided was worthless. Back when I still kept an office at the plant, there was a flat file cabinet in the corner of the tool room. Steel, 4 drawers, painted the same industrial green as half the equipment on the floor. It had sat there since 1991. It was locked. The key had been lost by my own hand, on purpose, sometime around 2015. I hadn't needed what was in it for years, and a lost key is its own kind of lock. Preston, I later found out from Sully, had asked about that cabinet twice in the past year. Told the shop manager it was an eyesore full of old blueprints that he wanted scrapped for a new inspection bench. The shop manager kept putting him off. Told him nobody could find a locksmith on short notice. That was Sully's doing quietly, without me ever asking. I went back to the shop on a Tuesday evening, after hours. Sully helped me in the side door, since my own keycard had been deactivated the same week as the vote. Nobody bothered mentioning that to me directly. We stood in front of that cabinet a long moment, Sully with a flashlight, me with a pry bar I hadn't touched in years. I felt something in my chest I hadn't expected, closer to grief than to triumph. The top 2 drawers held exactly what Preston assumed. Old blueprints, some mine from the earliest years, hand-drawn before we had any computer system at all. Drawings I could still read like a second language, 40 years on. Worth nothing to Preston. Worth everything to me, though not in dollars. The bottom 2 drawers held something else, Ruth's original ledgers, 30 years of them, in her own handwriting. Mechanical pencil script I'd have known blind. Every entry precise. Every column balanced by hand before I ever bought the company its first computer in 1996. And beneath the ledgers, in a plain manila envelope with my name written on it in Ruth's hand, the founding paperwork for the Ruth Cutler Furnace Street IP Trust. The original documents Marion and I had signed 11 years earlier, kept here instead of a safe deposit box, because Ruth had insisted that some things belong close to where the work happens, not locked away in a bank building 40 miles off. I sat down right there on an overturned bucket, in an empty tool room at 9 at night, and read through 3 of Ruth's old ledgers by flashlight. In the margin of one page from 1994, I found a note in her handwriting I hadn't seen in years, had entirely forgotten existed. Protect the drawings, not just the machines, it said, next to a payment to a patent search firm. An early cousin of the work Marion would later do for us. Ruth had understood, decades before any lawyer told either of us in plain language, that the real value of what we'd built was never the steel. It was the ideas that made the steel worth anything. I put that ledger in my truck that night, along with the manila envelope, left the blueprints and the rest of the ledgers exactly where they'd sat for decades. Preston still believed that cabinet held nothing but scrap. I saw no reason to correct him yet. Marion, when I brought her Ruth's ledger and the trust paperwork the following week, went quiet a long moment, turned pages slowly, the way you'd turn pages in something closer to a Bible than a business record. "Your wife was better at this than half the lawyers I trained with," she said finally. I told her I already knew that. I'd known it for 41 years. She asked to keep a photocopy of one page in particular, the margin note about protecting the drawings, and I let her. She said in 18 years of estate and corporate work, she'd rarely seen a document speak so plainly to intent. Most legal papers are written to survive an argument nobody's having yet. Ruth's ledger wasn't written for a lawyer at all. It was written for a husband who'd need reminding someday of what actually mattered. Marion told me that was worth more in a courtroom than most of the polished language she bills clients hundreds of dollars an hour to draft. I believed her. I'd believed Ruth's handwriting my whole life without needing a lawyer to confirm it was worth something. I asked Marion before I left that day whether she thought Ruth had somehow known, back then, that it would come to this exact shape. A son-in-law, a boardroom, a vote instead of a resignation. She said she doubted Ruth had pictured Preston specifically, since Preston hadn't even entered the family yet when the ledger note was written. But she said something else that stayed with me longer than a direct answer would have. "Your wife didn't need to picture the man," Marion said. "She only needed to understand the kind of man who eventually shows up in every family that builds something worth taking." She wrote the note for him before he had a face, with the founding documents confirmed and dated, with Ruth's ledger corroborating the timeline down to the payment records. Marion said we were as solid as any filing in the country could make us. "Nobody can argue timing now," she said. "Nobody can claim you backdated anything or invented a defense after the fact. This has been sitting quietly since before Preston Vance ever proposed to your daughter." That fact mattered more to me than almost anything else in this whole business. Preston liked to imply, in comments dropped at family gatherings, that my sudden interest in old paperwork was the scheming of a bitter old man who couldn't accept being pushed aside. He had no idea the paperwork was 11 years old. He had no idea his wife's mother had put her name on the very trust that would eventually undo him. He was building his defense on a story that assumed I'd started fighting back the week he fired me. In truth, I'd finished building the wall a full decade before he ever climbed high enough to see it. We spent the following month, Marion and I, doing what she called closing every seam. She confirmed, through the state licensing board and a discreet records request, exactly what Preston had shown his coatings lender about the promised deal. It was worse than either of us expected. He'd submitted a term sheet, unsigned but detailed, describing a non-exclusive license of Cutler Precision's core fastener coating patents to an outside aerospace distributor for an upfront payment of $420,000, more than enough to cover his $290,000 loan guarantee, with a comfortable margin left over. He'd shown that term sheet as evidence the deal was all but done. He hadn't disclosed because he didn't know that the patents named in it belonged to a trust he had no authority to license on behalf of. Marion also confirmed something I hadn't expected. It chilled me more than the loan itself. Preston had, 6 weeks before firing me, quietly commissioned what he called a wellness consultation, arranged through a family friend, a geriatric care coordinator, paid $900 for an informal cognitive screening, something he intended to use, if needed, to support a future claim that I was no longer fit to manage my own affairs. The screening came back entirely normal, sharper than normal, according to the coordinator's private notes, which Sully's cousin at the bank confirmed existed in a file Preston never showed anyone. Preston had built himself a fallback plan in case the board vote alone wasn't enough, a plan to paint me as a confused old man who needed protecting from his own decisions. It came back and told him the opposite of what he wanted to hear. He quietly buried it rather than let it embarrass him. That landed in me hard. I've said I don't raise my voice, and I didn't raise it then either. But I sat in my truck outside Marion's office the day she told me about that wellness consultation, and I gripped the wheel a good while before I could make myself drive home. Not because I was afraid of what he'd tried to do, because of what it told me about the man my daughter had married. He hadn't simply wanted my board seat. He'd been quietly preparing, months in advance, to have me declared unfit. To use the oldest fear a man my age carries, the fear of being called confused, incompetent, finished, as a tool to take what he wanted. And to do it with my own daughter's signature on the paperwork, if it ever came to that. Confused. As if the 46 years I'd spent holding this company's tolerances tighter than any competitor in 400 miles had somehow left me unable to read my own bank statement. As if a man who could still true a warped fixture plate by ear had gone soft in the one place that actually mattered to Preston, his judgment about who owned what. That was the moment I stopped thinking of what I was building with Marion as defence. It became something closer to an inspection. You don't get angry at a part that fails a tolerance check. You document exactly where it failed. You note it. You make certain it never gets installed anywhere that depends on it holding. Preston had failed his tolerance check. I intended to document it completely and let the failure show itself. In public, at the exact moment he was standing in front of everyone, claiming the part was sound. Marion and I settled on the timing over the following weeks. Preston's loan came due in a little over 9 weeks from the vote. He'd need the licensing deal closed well before then to have any hope of covering it. That meant he'd push hard for a board vote as soon as legally possible, likely within a month or 6 weeks. Marion's plan was simple in its shape, though it took her a great deal of careful drafting to make it airtight. Let Preston bring his deal all the way to the board. Let him present it in full. Let him celebrate it in front of everyone who'd voted me out. Only then would Marion step forward with the Federal Registry printout and read aloud, in that same room, the exact clause that had already killed the deal the moment they cast their votes. I met with Sully twice more during that stretch. Always after hours, always quiet. He confirmed Preston had scheduled a special board session, unusual for a company that normally met quarterly, for a date 7 weeks out. Preston had told 2 other board members, off the record, that he expected a major announcement. I told Sully what I knew. He didn't ask many questions. He never has. He just nodded, the same short nod from the parking lot the day of the vote. Told me he'd be standing in the back of that room too, same as always when the day came. There was one more piece of the picture I got that same week, and I got it from a place I never expected. My grandson Danny, 7 years old at the time, mentioned it at his soccer game without knowing what he was handing me. He said his dad, meaning Preston, had been on the phone a lot lately, yelling real quiet, was how Danny put it, in the garage with the door shut, and that once he'd heard the word house a bunch of times and gotten scared they were moving. I told Danny nobody was making him move anywhere. I said it plain and calm, the way I say most things to that boy, because a 7-year-old doesn't need his grandfather's worry added on top of his own. But I filed it away, the same as I'd filed away Relieved, and Shortfall, and the fork stopping over pot roast. A child repeats what he hears without knowing its weight. Sometimes that's the clearest window into a house you'll ever get. I mentioned that conversation to Marion the next time I saw her, and she went quiet a moment, the way she does when something matters more than it first appears to. Children are the worst kept secret in every family, she said. Adults think they don't understand what they're hearing. They understand plenty. They just don't know yet which parts are supposed to be secrets. I thought about that a long while driving home. I thought about how much of what I'd learned in this whole business had come from people nobody in that boardroom would have thought to ask. A shop foreman, a bank teller's cousin, a 7-year-old boy repeating his father's fear back to his grandfather at a soccer game, not understanding he'd just handed that grandfather the clearest proof yet of how frightened Preston really was. I drove home that night past the cemetery, stopped, the way I'd started doing more often that season than I probably should admit. I stood at Ruth's stone under the oak tree. I told her what I'd found in the flat file cabinet, what Preston had tried to arrange behind closed doors with a stranger's clipboard and a $900 fee. I told her the trust bearing her name was about to do exactly what she'd hoped it would do, all those years ago, protect what our hands had built from anybody who thought a signature was the same thing as ownership. You always did keep better books than anybody who ever tried to check your work, I told her. The wind moved through the oak leaves. I stood there longer than I meant to. Then I drove home. There was still a great deal of careful, quiet work left before the day Preston Vance stood up in front of that board again, certain he had finally won. 2 weeks after Sully's call about the lawsuit threat, I decided it was time to sit down with the full accounting. What this whole business had actually cost and what it stood to cost still. I've never once in my life gone into a job without knowing the numbers cold. I wasn't about to start with the most important job of my life. I sat at my kitchen table one evening with a legal pad, the same kind I'd used to estimate jobs since 1980. I wrote it all down, plain, the way Ruth used to write her ledgers, Cutler Precision Tool. Worth $11 million on paper. The building on Furnace Street, purchased for $62,000 in 1995, now carried at just under $1,800,000, free and clear. The equipment on that floor, $3 million to replace today. My own retirement accounts, built slowly across 4 decades, standing at just over $2,100,000, entirely separate from the company. The house Ruth and I built in 1998, appraised now at $490,000. Preston's guaranteed loan against his own house, $290,000, due in 6 weeks. The $420,000 licensing payment he'd promised a lender, a payment that didn't exist as a legal possibility. The $65,000 bridge loan he'd tried arranging on top of it. The $900 wellness consultation, paid out of an account Joanne didn't know existed. $60,000, the legal fees from the old patent dispute that taught me to build the trust in the first place. $14,000, Marion's total retainer across 11 years. The cheapest insurance I ever bought by a wide margin. $18,000, a trade school fund I'd quietly started for Danny the year he was born, sitting untouched in an account only Marion and I knew about. $20,000, Joanne's own money, sunk into Preston's venture without ever earning a dime back. $6,200, the appraised value of Ruth's wedding ring, still in my safe deposit box, nowhere near Preston's reach, though I'd heard he once asked Joanne, offhand, what it might be worth just out of curiosity. I looked at that whole list a long while. Numbers alone don't tell a story. But laid out plain in a column, they told me something I already suspected. Preston wasn't a man overreaching for a fortune. He was a man drowning quietly for months, trying to bail out a sinking boat with a bucket he didn't own. Borrowed from a house that wasn't fully his either, once the bank finished with it. Built on the promise of patents that had never belonged to him at all, I felt something close to pity, sitting there. Not enough to change what needed to happen next, but enough to remind me the man on the other side of this wasn't a villain out of a story, just a frightened man who'd made one bad bet after another until the bets became the whole of his life. I called Marion the next day and read her the list. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "You know the numbers better than most CFOs I've worked with, Delbert." I told her I ought to. I'd spent 46 years making sure every dollar in that shop was accounted for down to the cent. A man who loses track of small numbers eventually loses track of the big ones too. I'd watched that happen to men I respected more than I ever respected Preston. 10 days before the special board session, Marion called me into her office one more time. This visit felt different, more like a final inspection before you sign off on a job. She laid out piece by piece exactly what she intended to do the day of the meeting. I want to walk you through it the way she walked it through me, because every piece mattered, and because a plan only holds together if the man depending on it understands each bolt in it, not just the finished shape. First, she would attend the meeting herself, invited formally as legal counsel to the trust, a right reserved in the trust's founding documents, the ones Ruth and I had signed 11 years earlier, without ever imagining they'd be used this way. Preston's own attorneys, a firm out of Harrisburg with no background in intellectual property law, would have no grounds to object. The invitation followed the trust's own bylaws to the letter. Second, she would say nothing, not one word, until Preston finished his full presentation. Let him walk the board through the licensing deal, top to bottom. Let him name the $420,000 payment. Let him describe how it would secure the company's next chapter. Let every board member nod along. Let Randall nod along. Let it feel, for those few minutes, like the deal was as good as closed. Third, only after Preston called for a vote to formally authorise the agreement, Marion would stand, identify herself for the record, produce the Federal Registry printout, dated that same week, showing every one of the 7 patents assigned solely to the Ruth Cutler Furnace Street IP Trust. She would read Section 4 of the original licensing agreement aloud, the clause terminating the company's revocable license, automatically upon my removal from the board, for any reason other than voluntary written resignation. She would note, for the record, the exact date of my removal. And the exact date, 11 years earlier, the clause had been executed and filed. I asked her what happened after that. The deal would collapse in that room immediately, she said, because Cutler Precision Tool would have nothing left to license. The outside distributor's representatives, if present, would have every reason to walk out and consider the company compromised. Preston's promise to his lender and to his former partner would become instantly, publicly, undeniably false. In front of the one room full of people whose good opinion he needed most, I asked one more question that day, the one that had been sitting under my ribs for weeks. Was there any door left open at all for Preston to salvage the deal once the truth came out? Some negotiation, some settlement, some path where it didn't all have to end the way it looked like it was going to end. Marion looked at me a long moment before answering. "There's always a door, Delbert," she said. "It's just not one Preston gets to open. It's one you get to open if you want to. And you don't have to decide that today." I thought about that a long while, driving home. I thought about Ruth's voice, telling me not to let anyone put their name on what my hands had made. I thought about my daughter at that kitchen table. Thin voice telling me she should have said something and hadn't. I decided, somewhere on that drive down the turnpike, that whatever door existed, I would leave it standing, unlocked, without promising anyone I would walk them through it. A man's character is proven less by whether he opens a door, and more by whether he leaves one standing at all when he had every right to seal it shut. A week after that conversation with Marion, I drove out to the shop on a quiet Thursday morning. Not to confront anyone, just to walk the floor the way I used to every day for decades. The way a man checks on a garden even after he's handed the hoe to somebody else. Sully met me at the side door, same as always. Walked with me down the main aisle, past the mills, past the inspection bench, past the corner where the flat file cabinet still sat, its bottom 2 drawers, a little lighter than the week before. "Preston's been asking about you," Sully said low as we walked. "Asked me twice this week if I knew where you'd been spending your time." I asked what he'd told him. Sully allowed himself the closest thing to a smile I'd seen out of him in months. "Told him you'd taken up fishing," he said. "Man believed me too. We stopped by the machine where a young apprentice, a kid named Marcus, was running a batch of fasteners." Sully nodded toward him. "That one's good," he said. "Listens the way you used to make everybody listen." Preston wanted to lay him off last spring. Said the numbers didn't justify a 4th apprentice. I asked what happened. "Randall overruled him," Sully said. "First time in 2 years I saw your son push back on something Preston wanted. I filed that away too. Quiet, the same way I'd filed away the word relieved months earlier. Small things told you which way a man's weather was turning, long before the storm arrived." I asked Sully, before we moved on, how long Marcus had been with us. He said just over a year, hired the same season Preston had started pushing hardest for what he called leaner headcount. Sully said he'd fought to keep that hire on the books, quietly, the same way he'd fought to keep the flat file cabinet locked. I told him I owed him more than a retirement gift could ever cover whenever that day came. Sully just shrugged, the way he shrugs off most compliments, and said keeping good people around wasn't a favour to me, it was just good practice, the same as keeping a machine calibrated. You don't wait for it to break before you check it. I watched Marcus work a few minutes, the boy's hands steady, careful, checking his own work twice before moving on. I thought about myself at that same age, 40-some years earlier, alone in a rented garage with one lathe and a wife 3 months pregnant, betting everything on the idea that careful, patient work eventually gets noticed by somebody who matters. It had taken Ruth noticing first. It had taken a bank willing to extend me $400 of credit when I had nothing else to offer as collateral but my own 2 hands and a promise. I hoped, watching Marcus, that whatever happened in that boardroom, this shop would still be standing solid enough, 10 years on, for a kid like that to build the same kind of life out of it. Before I left the shop that Thursday, I stopped by the break room where Preston had made his desperate call to the lender. I stood there a moment, looking at the vending machine, the same one that had sat in that corner since 2003. Still stocked with the same brand of coffee nobody much liked, but everybody drank anyway. I thought about the $290,000 hanging over that house on Larchmont Drive. The $65,000 bridge loan. Grant Feeney's lawsuit threat sitting in a lawyer's drawer waiting to be filed. A man who builds his whole life on borrowed money and borrowed confidence eventually runs out of both at the same moment, usually in front of the people he most wanted to impress. I bought a coffee from that machine and drank it standing there alone. I thought about how strange it was that I felt no anger at all, only a kind of patient clarity. The same clarity I feel standing over a warped part, deciding whether it can be salvaged or needs to be scrapped entirely. Preston, I'd decided, could still be salvaged in whatever way a man like that gets salvaged. But the deal he was building his whole future on could not. I intended to let the truth make that distinction plain, rather than making it myself with a raised voice. Randall found me on the floor before I left that day. For a moment, neither of us said much. Just stood together near the loading dock, the way we used to when he was young and I was teaching him to read a torque wrench. Finally, he said, "Dad, whatever's coming at that board meeting, I want you to know, I didn't help set it up. Whatever Preston's planning, I wasn't part of the planning." I told him I believed that. I did mostly, though I also believed my son had spent 2 years failing to ask the one question that might have stopped all of it cold: whether the patents he assumed the company owned were actually the company's to own. I didn't say that part to him yet. Some lessons land better delivered by the facts themselves. Randall glanced back toward the shop floor, toward Marcus and the mill, and the whole quiet machinery of the place. Before he spoke again, "I keep thinking about something else too," he said. "The day of the vote. I told myself I was voting for the company. I don't think that's fully true anymore." I asked him what he thought was true instead. He didn't answer right away. He looked down at his own hands a long moment, the same hands I'd once wrapped around a torque wrench when he was 9 years old, showing him how much force was enough and how much was too much. "I think I was voting to make Preston stop being difficult at Sunday dinners," he said finally. Quiet, almost ashamed of how small it sounded out loud. "That's an ugly reason to vote a man off his own board." I told him it was an honest one, at least. Honest and ugly aren't always different things. Most men, myself included, have voted for smaller reasons than they'd like to admit, at least once in their lives. He was quiet a moment, looking out at the loading dock, hands in his pockets. I could see him working something over before he said it. "I keep thinking about the numbers," he said finally. "Preston told the board this deal was worth $420,000 up front, $1 million won over 5 years. I never once asked him to show me the underlying patent chain. I just took the number and ran with it because it sounded good in a quarterly meeting. I told him that's a mistake plenty of smart men make, taking a number at face value because the man saying it sounds sure of himself. The whole trick I'd learned over 46 years, was never trusting a number until you'd traced it back yourself to where it actually came from. "I've been going over the old contracts," Randall said, almost like he was confessing something. "The original patent assignments, from back when I was a kid. I found the trust paperwork referenced in an old filing footnote last week. Couldn't figure out why I'd never noticed it before. I told him nobody had ever needed him to notice it before. That's the nature of a foundation. Nobody thinks about it until the day the building above it starts to lean." He looked at me a long moment, then he said something that told me more about where his head was than any board meeting could have. "I should have asked you directly a long time ago, instead of just trusting whatever Preston told me." I told him that was true. Trust, once badly spent, has to be earned back slowly. The same way you true up a badly warped plate. A little at a time, never all at once. I told him I was willing to do that work with him, if he was willing to. He said he was. I believed him. Time would tell whether belief and follow-through matched up the way they hadn't. Quite with Preston. 6 days before the meeting, I had dinner again at Joanne's house. At her invitation this time, I watched Preston more closely than I'd ever watched a piece of equipment in my life. He looked thinner than I remembered, laughed too quickly at things that weren't especially funny, kept checking his phone under the table, a habit Joanne noticed too. I could tell from the way her eyes tracked his hand every time it moved. At one point, over dessert, Preston looked at me and said, almost gently, "You know, Delbert, once this licensing deal closes, things are going to be easier for everybody. I want you to know that. I know it's been a rough stretch." I looked at him a long moment. I thought about the $290,000 loan against his own house. I thought about Grant Feeney's lawsuit threat. I thought about the $900 wellness consultation he'd quietly commissioned to have me declared unfit if his other plans failed. And I said plain and calm, the way I say most things, I hope it goes exactly the way you're expecting it to, Preston. He smiled at that, relieved, thinking I'd offered him some kind of blessing. I hadn't. I told him the truth. He'd heard only the part he wanted to hear. That's always been, in my experience, the way men like Preston hear most things, right up until the day they can't anymore. Danny, my grandson, asked me that night if I'd come to his next school assembly. He was getting a small certificate for a reading program he'd worked hard at all semester. I told him I wouldn't miss it for anything. I meant it. Driving home, I thought about how strange it was. In the middle of dismantling the financial foundation his own father had tried to build on lies, I could still sit at that table and love that boy without any complication in it at all. Some things stay simple even when everything around them gets complicated. A grandson's certificate is one of them. 4 days before the meeting, I drove to Pittsburgh one final time to sit with Marion. On the drive back, I stopped, on an impulse I couldn't fully explain, at a small cemetery outside a town called Mill Haven, 40 minutes off my usual route. Ruth's parents were buried there, plain, hard-working folks who'd never had much money, but raised a daughter who understood the value of things better than anyone I ever met with an accounting degree. I stood at their stones a while, told them their daughter's handwriting was about to save a company from a man who'd never once bothered to ask a single honest question about what he was inheriting into. Ruth's mother, Eleanor, used to say something to me at family dinners, decades back, that I'd mostly forgotten until I stood there that afternoon. "The quiet ones always keep the real books, Delbert," she told me once, watching Ruth balance a checkbook by hand while I complained about paperwork. Don't ever mistake quiet for empty. I hadn't understood at the time that she was telling me something about her own daughter, something that would matter more than either of us could have guessed. 40 years before a son-in-law neither of them ever met would try to prove exactly the opposite. Before I left Mill Haven, I stopped at a small hardware store on the town's main street, the kind of place that's mostly gone now, replaced by big box stores an hour's drive from anywhere small. I bought a box of nails I didn't need, just to have a reason to talk with the man behind the counter a minute. An old habit from my working years, when a hardware store counter was where half the real business of a town got done. He asked what brought me through Mill Haven. I told him I'd come to visit some family graves. He nodded, the way small-town men nod at that kind of answer. No more questions needed. I drove the rest of the way home with the windows cracked. The late afternoon air smelled like cut hay from the fields along the turnpike. I thought about how much of a man's life comes down to a handful of quiet places. A cemetery, a hardware counter, a kitchen table. Places where nothing dramatic ever happens, and everything that matters gets decided anyway. I drove home that evening thinking about how much of what protected me in this whole business came, in the end, from women who never once raised their voices either. Ruth with her ledgers, Marion with her folders, Eleanor with her quiet warning at a kitchen table decades ago. I've spent my whole life around machines loud enough to need ear protection, and yet every single thing that actually saved this company came from someone who never once needed to shout to be heard. 3 days before the meeting, Randall called me for the first time in weeks. He sounded different, careful. The way a man sounds when he starts to notice a draft coming from somewhere in a house he thought was sealed tight. He asked me, out of nowhere, whether I still held any of the company's core patents personally. Just as a formality question, for the board packet. I told him the truth, the same truth I'd have told anyone who asked directly. I hold every one of them, Randall. I always have. He went quiet a long moment. Then he asked, quieter still, "Does Preston know that?" I told him I honestly didn't know what Preston knew, only what Preston had never once asked me directly. The same question Randall was asking now, 4 years too late to matter as much as it might have. I hung up and sat in my kitchen a long while, turning it over. I didn't know for certain whether Randall had simply been curious, or whether some instinct in him, some memory of the father who'd taught him everything about a shop floor, had started quietly waking back up. I hoped it was the second one. I didn't let myself count on it. The night before the special board session, I drove to the cemetery one more time. I stood under the oak tree a long while, longer than usual. I told Ruth everything, start to finish, the way I'd have told her if she was sitting across the kitchen table instead of under a stone. I told her about the flat file cabinet, her ledgers, the note in the margin she probably didn't even remember writing. I told her the trust bearing her name was about to do exactly the work she'd hoped it would do, someday. Though neither of us had ever wanted it to be this soon, or this way, or against a man who'd married into our family instead of a stranger entirely. Tomorrow, I told her, they're going to find out the drawings were never his to give away. The wind moved through the leaves the way it always did. I stood there until the cold pushed me back toward the truck. I drove home and slept better than I had in weeks. The particular dreamless sleep of a man who has done everything within his power to make a hard thing right, and has nothing left to do now but wait for the day to arrive. I slept fitfully that final night before the session anyway, despite the calm I'd told Ruth about at her graveside. Not from fear, from the particular restlessness of a man who has finished all his preparation and has nothing left to occupy his hands. I got up twice in the dark and stood in the kitchen, looking out at the garden by moonlight, the tomato stakes standing like a row of small, quiet soldiers. I thought about the $450 lathe one more time, about the $1,100 in savings, about how far a man can travel in 46 years if he's careful and patient, and lucky enough to marry a woman who keeps better books than he does. Then I went back to bed and I slept. Finally, the last few hours before dawn, and I woke when the alarm went off feeling steadier than I had any right to feel. The morning of the special board session, I put on the same grey suit I'd worn to Ruth's funeral. It was the only suit I owned that still fit right. There was something fitting, I thought, about wearing it to a room where a different kind of ending was about to arrive. I picked up Marion at her office on Grant Street at 8. We drove the hour and 10 minutes back to Drayton Falls together, mostly in silence, the comfortable kind two people share when the talking's already been done, and only the doing is left. I want to tell you plainly, I had not been formally invited to that meeting. I no longer held a board seat. Preston, when Marion told the company's outside counsel she'd be attending as legal representative for the trust, apparently assumed that meant I would stay home. He was wrong. The trust's own bylaws, the ones Marion and I drafted 11 years earlier, gave the trustee, meaning me, the right to be present for any meeting where trust-held assets were discussed. Marion made certain that Wright was on record days in advance. In writing. Impossible to quietly deny at the door. On that drive back, Marion told me something I've held on to since. People think a case like this gets won in the moment you produce the document, she said, eyes on the road. It doesn't. It gets won 11 years earlier, in a quiet office, by a man willing to do the boring, careful thing nobody else in the room thought was necessary yet. I told her that sounded like most of what I'd learned running a machine shop too. The boring, careful thing, done consistently, long before anybody's watching. That's the whole of it. Nobody ever built a company, or protected one, out of a single dramatic gesture. They built it, and protected it, out of 10,000 small correct choices nobody else even noticed making. We stopped once on the way, at a diner outside Greensburg that Ruth and I used to visit on drives back from Pittsburgh decades earlier. I ordered the same coffee and eggs I always ordered there. Marion had tea. For a few minutes neither of us talked about Preston or the board meeting at all. She asked about the shop's early years instead. The $450 lathe. The $1,100 in savings. I told her the whole story again, the way I've told it here. She listened the way she always listened, taking it in without rushing me toward the part that mattered to her professionally. I appreciated that more than I ever told her directly. Some people only want the parts of your life that serve their purposes. Marion Attaway, in 18 years, never once made me feel like that. So when Marion and I walked into the reception area of Cutler Precision Tool, that morning, 40 minutes before the session was set to start, the young receptionist one Preston had hired the year before looked at me like she wasn't sure whether to let me pass the front desk. Sully, standing near the hallway with a clipboard he didn't need, caught my eye and gave the smallest nod. Walked over and told her plainly that I was expected. That Mrs. Attaway's letter had already cleared it with the front office days earlier. The girl let us through, uncertain but unwilling to make a scene. Sully caught my eye again as Marion and I waited for the boardroom doors to open. He walked over, quiet, and stood beside me a moment without saying anything. The same silence he'd stood in the day of my firing, months before. Finally he said, low enough that only I could hear it, "Whatever happens in there, Delbert, 42 people on that floor already know who really built this place. That much never needed a boardroom to prove it." I told him I appreciated that more than he probably realised. I meant it. A man can win every legal argument in the world and still feel hollow if the people who worked beside him for decades never understood what he was fighting for. Sully understood. He always had. Preston was already in the boardroom when we walked in. Randall too. The 4 other board members who'd voted me out. 3 men in suits I recognised from Sully's description as representatives of the outside aerospace distributor. I noticed, taking my seat, that the same walnut table I'd shimmed level myself back in 1996 still sat perfectly true beneath a laptop, a water pitcher, and Preston's polished folder of slides, holding, as it always had, exactly the load it was built to carry. Joanne was there too, seated near the back, which surprised me. She'd never once attended a board meeting in all the years Randall had run the place. I learned later she'd come at Danny School's request, needing to leave early for his assembly, and had decided to sit in on part of her husband's big moment first. I believe, looking back, some instinct in her wanted to see this meeting with her own eyes, though I don't think she understood yet what she was actually about to see. I want to describe that boardroom for a moment. I sat in it, in one form or another, for 46 years, and I noticed things that morning I might have missed on any ordinary Tuesday. The long walnut table down the centre, bought second-hand from a bankrupt furniture wholesaler back in 1996 for $1,100, still solid, still level, because I'd shimmed its legs myself the week we brought it in and checked it twice a year. Ever since. The window behind the head chair looked out over the loading dock. Past it, if you knew where to look, the corner of the parking lot where I'd sat in my truck months earlier, finishing a cup of coffee while Preston begged a stranger not to call his house again. Preston looked up when Marion and I walked in. I watched something flicker across his face. Fast, gone almost before it landed, somewhere between confusion and the first faint edge of alarm. He recovered quickly. He always did. "Delbert, Mrs. Attaway. Good of you to join us," he said. Pleasant enough. The voice of a man who's decided the smart move is to act like nothing about this is strange at all. I nodded and took a seat near the back, beside Sully. Marion took a seat closer to the table, folder in hand, saying nothing yet, exactly as we'd planned. Arthur Delaney called the meeting to order at 9 sharp, the way he always did. Read a short opening statement about the purpose of the special session. Careful, procedural language that told nobody in that room anything they didn't already believe they knew. Preston stood, buttoned his jacket, and thanked everyone for making time, his voice smooth and confident, the voice of a man who'd rehearsed this moment enough times in front of a mirror that the words no longer felt like risk. I watched Preston take a sip of water before he began, and I noticed his hand wasn't quite steady on the glass. A small thing, the kind of thing only a man who spent 46 years watching hands for a living would catch. I said nothing about it. I simply noted it, the way you note a hairline crack in a casting before you decide whether it's cosmetic or structural. Preston began his presentation. I'll say this for him, whatever else is true. He could talk. He walked the board through 18 months of strategic groundwork, a licensing partnership with the outside distributor that would bring, in his words, a transformative capital infusion. He named the $420,000 upfront payment. He described a 5-year royalty structure on top of it, projecting, with the kind of confident round numbers men like Preston always seem to have ready, an additional $1.1 million over the life of the agreement. The board nodded along. Randall nodded along, taking notes. Engaged, the way a son engages when he genuinely believes his father-in-law is delivering something good for the family. The men from the distributor sat with the particular stillness of men who've already decided to say yes and are waiting for the formal moment to say it. I sat and listened to every word without interrupting once. That cost me something, sitting there, listening to a man describe exactly how he intended to sell something that was never his, in a room full of people who trusted him to know better. But I'd promised Marion and myself that I would let him finish completely. You let the cut finish before you touch the machine. Preston walked through a slide deck, actual slides projected on the wall, the kind of presentation I'd never once needed in 46 years of running that same company, full of terms like synergistic capital deployment and forward-looking royalty capture. Terms that meant, as far as I could tell, nothing more than the plain fact that a stranger was going to hand him money in exchange for tooling designs he did not, in point of fact, control. He gestured at a chart showing revenue climbing steadily over 5 years. A chart built, I understood now, on a foundation with a crack running clean through the middle. A crack not one person in that room, besides myself and Marion, could see. Randall, sitting near the middle of the table, glanced back at me once during Preston's opening remarks. Quick, almost involuntary. The kind of glance a son gives a father out of old habit, even after 2 years of distance. I kept my face still. I'd promised myself, and Marion, that I would give nothing away before the moment came. I intended to keep that promise all the way through, no matter how many times a familiar face turned my way, looking for a signal I wasn't ready yet to send. One of the other directors, a soft older gentleman named Phil Garner, who'd served with me on that board for nearly 15 years, raised a hand partway through, asked mildly whether the patents named in the agreement had been confirmed as clear for licensing. It was, I thought at the time, and still think now, the single most important question anyone but Marion asked in that entire meeting. Preston answered it the way a man answers a question he's decided in advance not to take seriously. Standard company IP, Preston said, waving a hand, moving straight to his next slide before Phil could follow up. Nothing unusual there. I watched Phil nod, satisfied. The way a decent man nods when he trusts the person answering and has no particular reason yet to doubt it. I thought, watching that exchange, about how close an honest question had come to unravelling the whole thing 6 minutes early, and how easily a confident man's tone can talk a good question right back into silence. I glanced at Marion beside me. She hadn't moved, hadn't so much as shifted in her chair when Phil asked his question, or when Preston brushed it aside. She'd told me, back in her office, that patience meant staying still even when a door cracks open early, because a door that opens too soon can close again just as fast if you rush through it wrong. I understood, watching her sit there, calm as a held breath, exactly what she meant. The whole deal could have unravelled right then, on Phil's honest question alone, and Marion had let it pass anyway, because our moment wasn't that moment. Our moment was still coming, built for maximum weight, and neither of us intended to spend it early on a question Preston could still wriggle out from under. Preston clicked to his final slide, a simple one, just the company logo and the words, "Our next chapter," in a clean, confident font some designer had probably charged him a few $1,000s for. He looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn, saving mine for last. He held my gaze half a second longer than anyone else's. The way a man does when he wants one specific person to feel the full weight of a moment he thinks belongs entirely to him. Preston reached his close. "I'd like to move," he said, looking around the table with the warmth of a man who believes he's about to be thanked, that the board formally authorised the licensing agreement as presented, effective immediately, so we can finalise signatures with our partners here today. One of the other board members started to second the motion. That's when Marion Attaway stood up. She didn't raise her voice. I want that understood. It mattered to me, watching her do it, that she handled the room exactly the way I would have handled a piece of equipment about to fail. Calm, precise, without drama. "Before this board votes," she said, "I'd like the record to reflect a filing that affects the subject matter of this motion directly." Preston's smile held a half second too long, the way a man's smile holds when his mind hasn't caught up yet to what his gut has already started to suspect. Marion opened her folder, set a single sheet of paper on the table, slid it toward the centre, where every board member could see it. This is a certified printout from the United States Patent and Trademark Office, she said, dated this past Tuesday, showing the current ownership status of the 7 patents named in the term sheet Mr. Vance has just presented. She let that sit a moment. Every one of those 7 patents is assigned, and has been assigned for the past 11 years, to the Ruth Cutler Furnace Street IP Trust, sole trustee, Delbert J. Cutler. Cutler Precision Tool holds no ownership interest in any of them. It holds, and has only ever held, a revocable license. I watched Preston's face while she spoke. I've spent 46 years reading the moment a piece of metal is about to fail, under load. That fraction of a second where the tone changes right before the crack. I saw exactly that moment cross Preston's face, right there at the head of the table. That's a formality, Preston said. I could hear the crack widening in his own voice as he said it. The company's operated under that license for years. It's standard practice. It affects the license directly, Mr. Vance, Marion said, still calm, still unhurried, because the license itself contains an automatic termination clause. Section 4 of the original assignment agreement, executed and filed the same week the trust was formed. I'll read it into the record. She did, slowly, every word. The license terminates automatically upon the removal of Delbert J. Cutler from the company's board of directors, for any reason other than voluntary resignation submitted in writing by the trustee. The room went silent in a way I've only heard a shop floor go silent once or twice in my life, the kind of silence that follows a machine seizing mid-cut. Everyone understanding, all at once, that something had gone badly, irreversibly wrong. Nobody yet certain exactly how bad. You were voted off this board 4 months ago, Mr. Cutler, Marion said, turning to me for the first time. Formal, for the record. Not asked to resign. Voted, is that correct? That's correct, I said. 2 words. That's all I said in that entire meeting, right up until that point. 2 words. And the whole deal Preston had spent 18 months building came apart in the same room he'd built it in. One of the men from the distributor, a man in a grey suit who hadn't said a word the entire meeting, leaned toward his colleague and said something quiet I couldn't hear. Then he stood up. I think, he said, to no one in particular, we're going to need to reschedule this conversation. The 3 of them gathered their things without another word and walked out. The sound of that door closing behind them was, I believe, the exact moment it landed for Preston. $420,000 gone. A former partner threatening a lawsuit still waiting. A bank holding a note against his own house, unmoved. All of it evaporated in front of the one room full of people whose confidence he needed most. Preston stood there a long moment, both hands flat on the table. The same posture I'd seen him in from a distance in the parking lot, months before, bracing for a hit that had, this time, actually landed. He looked at me. You knew, he said, quiet now. No performance left in it at all. You knew this whole time and you let me stand up here and... I checked the tolerance 11 years ago, Preston, I said. You never once asked me what it was. I didn't raise my voice saying it. I never have needed to. Randall sat very still, looking at the printout, then at me, then at Preston. I watched my son's face do something I hadn't seen in a long while, genuinely thinking, hard and fast, about who in that room had actually told him the truth over the past 2 years and who hadn't. Joanne, from the back of the room, made a small sound. Not quite a word. I turned and looked at my daughter. And for the first time in longer than I could easily count, she looked straight back at me instead of down at whatever was in front of her. Arthur Delaney cleared his throat and called for order, though there wasn't much order left to call for. I think, he said carefully, we need to table this motion indefinitely and convene an emergency session with independent counsel. Heads nodded around the table. Slow, stunned nods. The kind people give when they are agreeing to something they don't yet fully understand the size of. Preston didn't sit back down. He stood there another long moment, then said, to the room, in a voice that had lost every bit of the polish it carried 20 minutes earlier, this is fixable. I can renegotiate the terms, I can go back to them. Mr. Vance, Marion said, still even, still without a single raised note in it. The term sheet you presented to your lender described a licensing arrangement Cutler Precision Tool was never authorized to offer. I'd strongly advise you retain your own personal counsel before you say anything further in this room." She wasn't threatening him. She was, in her own careful way, being kinder to him than he'd been to me in 2 years, warning a drowning man exactly where the current was strongest, before he swam straight into it. Randall stood up from the table then, walked over to where Marion had set the registry printout, picked it up himself, read the whole page, slowly, while the room waited. When he finished, he looked at Preston a long moment, then at me. "You told me he'd lost a step, Preston," he said, quiet, mostly to himself, though the whole room heard it. "You told me for 2 years he'd lost a step." Preston didn't answer him. There wasn't an answer left that would have helped him in that room. I want to tell you what I felt sitting there, watching a man's entire fabricated future collapse in real time. I did not feel joy. That matters more than the satisfaction would. I felt something closer to the stillness you feel when a long, difficult job is finally correctly finished. The kind of quiet that comes after you've poured a foundation exactly level, checked it 3 times, and watched the concrete finally set the way you always knew it would. Preston gathered his papers with hands that weren't quite steady. One of the other board members, a woman named Carol Reinhold, said, gently but firmly, "Preston, I think you should step out for a moment. The board needs to discuss how to proceed." He looked at Joanne at the back of the room, and something passed between them I wasn't close enough to read. Then he walked out, alone, past Sully, who didn't say a word to him, only watched him go the same steady way he'd watched everything else that morning. The meeting continued another 40 minutes without him. Arthur Delaney asked Marion formally, on the record, whether the trust would consider relicensing the patents under new terms, now that the prior license had lapsed. Marion looked at me before answering. A silent question passed between us, one we'd already discussed in the truck on the drive over. I gave her the smallest nod. "The trustee is open to discussing a new licensing arrangement," Marion said, "under terms that reflect the patent's actual value, and with governance protections that prevent this situation from recurring." That was the door I'd told her. Days earlier, I wanted left standing, not for Preston, for the company itself, for the 42 people on that shop floor who had nothing to do with any of this, for Randall, for the possibility, however distant it still felt in that room, that some version of what I'd built might survive intact for my grandson someday. The board thanked Marion, thanked me in the stiff, careful way people thank you when they're still absorbing how close they came to a disaster largely of their own making. I didn't say much more. I'd said what needed saying with 2 words earlier. Everything after that belonged to Marion, and to the paper, and to the clause that had been quietly sitting in a filing cabinet in Pittsburgh for 11 years, waiting for exactly this morning. The consequences, once they started, moved fast. The way water moves fast once a dam finally gives. Within 4 days, word reached the Coatings Ventures lender that the licensing deal Preston had promised as collateral for a bridge extension didn't exist, had never legally existed. The lender called the full $290,000 guarantee due in 30 days flat. No extension offered. No further conversation entertained. Within a week, Grant Feeney, Preston's former coatings partner, filed the lawsuit he'd been threatening for months. Mismanagement of partnership funds, a matter of public record in the county courthouse, the kind any local reporter with 20 minutes to spare could find and read. Preston resigned from Cutler Precision Tools board within 2 weeks of the meeting, before the board could formally vote to remove him for cause, which Arthur Delaney told me privately they were fully prepared to do. He also stepped down as chief financial officer the same week, citing, in the brief internal memo Randall later showed me, a desire to pursue other opportunities. Language so far from the truth, it would have made me laugh, if the whole business hadn't cost my daughter and grandson so much in the meantime. The house on Larchmont Drive went up for sale within 6 weeks, sold at a loss, after the bank moved to collect on the defaulted guarantee. The sale barely covered what remained owed once legal fees and penalties were added in. Joanne and Danny moved into a rental 2 streets over from where Joanne had grown up. Smaller, plainer. The kind of house that never would have interested Preston at all 4 years earlier. I helped them move in myself, on a Saturday, carrying boxes the way I'd carried boxes for that family my whole life. Only this time without a single person in the room, pretending my hands had gone too slow to be useful. Something here matters more than the rest. I did not go after Preston out of spite. I did not celebrate his ruin once it arrived. Watching a man's life come apart, even a man who tried to have me quietly declared unfit so he could seize what my hands had built, is not a thing that brought me any real pleasure. What I felt, watching it unfold, was closer to the relief you feel when a structural problem you'd flagged for months finally gets addressed, before the whole building comes down on somebody standing underneath it. Preston had been the problem. The reckoning wasn't revenge. It was the roof simply refusing, at last, to hold up a beam that had never been sound in the first place. The company itself came through it steadier than I expected. Marion negotiated a new licensing agreement between the Trust and Cutler Precision Tool within 2 months. This time with clear governance protections written directly into the bylaws. Protections requiring any future board vote affecting the Trust's patents to include the trustees' written consent. Protections that would have stopped Preston cold before he ever got as far as a special session. Randall, to his credit, pushed hard for those protections himself once he understood what nearly happened. I watched my son do something in those weeks I hadn't seen from him in years. Actually listen carefully to the difference between a company that runs well day to day and a company that survives the people who someday try to take it apart from the inside. I was reinstated to the board within that same stretch, not through any demand of mine, through a formal vote, unanimous this time, that Arthur Delaney told me afterward was the easiest vote this board has taken in a decade. I didn't gloat over it. I simply took the same chair I'd sat in for 46 years, sat down in it the way you sit down in any chair that's finally correctly yours again. There's a piece of this I haven't told you yet. I've been saving it. Not out of drama. It only made sense to me in its proper place, which is here after the dust had settled enough that I could finally sit with it the way it deserved. A few weeks after the board meeting, going through Ruth's things one more time, the way I still did every so often, I opened a cedar chest at the foot of our bed. Hadn't fully opened it in the 3 years since she'd passed. I found a letter, sealed, my name written on the front in her hand, dated the same week she'd signed the trust paperwork with Marion, 11 years back. She'd apparently written it that same week and never mentioned it, tucked it away for a day she must have hoped, in her heart, would never actually come. I sat on the edge of our bed and read it. I'll share the heart of it, because I think it belongs here more than anywhere else in this story. She wrote that she didn't know who, someday, might try to take what we'd built. A stranger, a competitor, or someone standing closer to us than either of us could imagine sitting at our own table. She wrote that she trusted me to know the difference between defending what was ours and punishing someone simply for wanting it. And then she wrote the line that undid me a little, sitting there alone. If it's someone Joanne loves, Delbert, be exact and be fair, and leave a door open. She'll need you to have left one, even if she can't ask for it herself. I sat with that letter a long while. Ruth had known, or at least suspected, 11 years before any of it happened, that the threat to what we'd built might not come from outside the family at all. She'd asked me in advance to be exactly the man I'd already decided, on my own, to be that morning in the boardroom. Exact. Fair. A door left standing. I called Joanne that evening and read her the letter. All of it, over the phone. Some things are better heard in a mother's own words than summarised secondhand by a father trying to find the right tone. She was quiet a long while after I finished. Then she said, "She really did think of everything, didn't she?" I told her yes. I told her that was the truest thing anyone had ever said about her mother. Preston, for his part, moved out of state within a few months. Took a lower position at a firm in Ohio, a long way down from where he'd stood 18 months earlier, promising a room full of confident men a $420,000 deal that was never his to offer. Joanne didn't go with him. The marriage didn't survive what came out in that boardroom. That wasn't a thing I ever wished on her, even watching everything Preston had tried to do. Grief and relief can sit in the same house together. Joanne carried both of them for a good long while, same as I once had to. She and Danny stayed in Drayton Falls. She started coming by the house on Sundays again, first alone, then with Danny. Eventually those Sundays turned into something closer to what they'd been years before Preston ever sat at our table. Easy. Unforced. The kind of visit where nobody's watching the clock or measuring their words. I never once brought up everything Preston had tried to arrange behind closed doors. The wellness consultation, the loan, the lawsuit. She learned pieces of it in her own time, from her own sources. Every time a new piece reached her, she came to me quietly, and we talked about it plainly, without either of us needing to raise our voice. Each time something in her seemed to settle a little further into place, like a part finally seated correctly, after sitting crooked in its housing for years. I should have said something at that dinner table. That first time he called you a legacy vote, she told me once, months later, sitting on my porch on a Sunday afternoon, while Danny ran around Ruth's garden chasing something only a 7-year-old can see. I knew it was wrong. I just didn't want to be the reason things got worse. I told her I understood that better than she probably realised. I'd spent 2 years telling myself similar things. To avoid a harder conversation, I didn't want to have either. We're neither of us as brave as we'd like to think, Joanne, I told her. The trick isn't never being scared. It's doing the right thing anyway. Eventually. Even if eventually takes longer than it should have. Randall and I found our way back to something steadier too. Slower than with Joanne. Most things between fathers and sons move slower than between fathers and daughters, at least in my experience. He came by the shop more often after the board meeting. Spent time on the floor again, the way he had as a young man, learning the trade under my hand. Before spreadsheets and quarterly projections pulled him mostly into an office upstairs. One afternoon, about 4 months after everything with Preston, he stood beside me at the mill while I trued up a fixture plate the old way, by ear. He asked me to show him how I did it. I did. It took him 3 tries to hear what I was listening for. On the 4th, something in his face changed. I hear it now. He said, quiet. I told him that was the whole trick, hearing it. Most people go their whole lives without ever bothering to listen closely enough to catch it. I want to tell you what the company looks like today, a little over a year out from that boardroom morning. The ending matters as much as the wound did at the start. Cutler Precision Tool is worth by Marion's last estimate somewhere north of $13 million now. Up from the $11 million it stood at, the year Preston tried to push me out. Mostly on the strength of 2 new aerospace contracts Randall landed himself. Contracts he closed, I should say plainly, entirely on his own merit, without a single word of interference from me. The Ruth Cutler Furnace Street IP Trust still holds all 7 patents, plus 2 new ones we filed together, Randall and Marion and I, this past spring. A fixture design he actually helped engineer himself, something I'd never have predicted 4 years ago, when Preston first started calling him the future, in a tone that always seemed to imply I was the past. 42 employees became 46. Sully finally retired last spring, 61 years old, 31 of them spent on our floor. I gave the retirement speech myself at his request, though I kept it short. Sully never did care much for long speeches. Neither, if I'm honest, do I. I told the room that Sully Doyle had caught more problems by standing quietly in the back of a room than most consultants catch with a whole team and a fee schedule to match. Every man and woman on that floor who'd worked alongside him for any length of time nodded along, because they all already knew it. We gave him a gift at that retirement party. The whole shop chipped in. A fully restored antique lathe, the same model as the one I'd started this whole company on back in 1980. Refurbished by a specialist out of Youngstown for just under $7,000. Money the crew raised themselves without ever telling me until it was already spent. Sully cried at that party, the only time in 31 years I ever once saw it happen. He told me afterward, quiet, just the 2 of us, that watching me hold that boardroom together without ever raising my voice had taught him more about running a floor than 3 decades of doing the work himself. I told him he'd taught me plenty too, mostly about the value of a man who watches carefully and says little. The shop wouldn't run half as well without somebody carrying that habit forward after him. Marcus, the young apprentice, has started standing in the back of production meetings the same way Sully used to, arms crossed, saying little, watching everything. I like to think some habits get inherited the same way a business does. Quietly, from the people who actually did the work. Preston, from what I understand, still owes money to more than one party from that whole affair. The Coatings Ventures' remaining debts, legal fees from Grant Feeney's lawsuit, which settled out of court for an amount Preston's own attorney reportedly described as painful. I don't track his life closely. I don't need to. I've never once needed a man's ruin explained to me in detail to feel the peace of knowing the truth eventually found its way to daylight. Phil Garner, the director who'd asked the one honest question that morning, stopped by the shop a few weeks after the meeting, unannounced, just to shake my hand. He told me he'd sat on that board for 15 years and never once seen a piece of paper do that much work in that shorter time. I told him the paper hadn't done the work. Ruth had, 11 years before either of us knew we'd need it. Phil didn't know Ruth well, but he nodded like he understood anyway, the way decent men do when they hear the shape of a good marriage, even second-hand. Carol Reinhold sent a card a month later, short, just a line about admiring how the whole thing had been handled, without a single raised voice in that room. I kept both gestures. Small things, but they told me the people who'd voted me off that board hadn't done it out of malice. They'd simply trusted the wrong man's numbers, the way honest people sometimes do, until somebody finally showed them the real ones. Joanne remarried nobody. Not yet. When I asked her once gently whether she felt she was missing something being on her own, she told me she'd finally learned what it felt like to make a decision entirely her own, without weighing it first against someone else's temper. She wasn't in any hurry to trade that feeling away for anything less than something real. I told her that sounded like the smartest thing either of her parents had ever taught her, though I doubt I taught it to her directly. I think Ruth's letter probably did more of that teaching than I ever managed with words alone. I should mention Marcus one more time, because his story is a small good thing that came out of all this, and I like to end on small good things when I can. Randall promoted him to full journeyman status this past spring, 2 years ahead of the usual schedule, after the boy caught a tolerance drift on a titanium batch that would have cost us a customer if it had shipped. I stood on that floor the day Randall told him, and I watched Marcus's face do exactly what my own face must have done the day my first big contract came through, decades back. Something between disbelief and a kind of quiet, private pride that doesn't need an audience to feel complete. Ruth would have liked that boy. She always did have a soft spot for the quiet ones who did good work and never once asked for credit. Danny is 8 now. He spends most Saturdays with me at the shop, same as I used to bring Randall around at that age. Decades back, before any of this, before Preston, before even the trust itself existed, as anything more than a worry Ruth carried quietly in the back of her mind. Last Saturday, I set him up at the mill with a scrap piece of aluminum, showed him how to run his fingers along the surface, told him to close his eyes and listen for what the metal was telling him. He got frustrated at first, the way any child does with something that asks more patience than he's used to giving. Then, on his third try, his whole face changed, the same way his father's had, 4 months after the boardroom. "I think I felt it that time, Grandpa," he said. I told him that was exactly right. The drawings and the machines both, in the end, only ever belong to whoever's patient enough to actually listen to them. I think about Ruth every day, still, more on some days than others. I keep the garden going same as always. This past summer, Joanne started helping me with it on Sundays. Danny picked the first tomato of the season himself. Proud as anything. Brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table, like it was something he'd built with his own 2 hands, which, in its own small way, I suppose he had. I still drive out to the cemetery most weeks, though less often than I did during that whole business with Preston. I don't need to visit as urgently now. The urgency, I've come to understand, was never really about Ruth. It was about needing somewhere quiet to sort through what living man couldn't yet say out loud to other living people. Now the sorting mostly happens at my own kitchen table, or on the porch, or standing beside a grandson at a mill, listening for a tone in a piece of metal that tells you whether it's true. Ruth is in all of those places too, just as much as she's under that oak tree. I think she always knew she would be. I think that's half of what that letter in the cedar chest was really telling me, underneath the practical parts about being exact and fair. She wasn't just protecting a company, she was making sure some piece of her stayed close enough to keep steadying me, long after she couldn't do it herself anymore. There's one more thing I want to tell you. It's the image I keep coming back to more than any other from this whole business. More than the boardroom, more than the printout, more even than the 2 words I said that morning that ended it all. It happened this past fall. A dusk in October, the light going gold and long across the yard, the way it does that time of year in this part of Pennsylvania. I was out behind the shop with Danny, showing him, for maybe the 10th time, how to true a fixture plate by ear. Joanne stood in the doorway of the shop, watching us, arms crossed against the evening chill. After a while she asked, quiet, almost like she wasn't sure she had the right to ask it at all, whether she could start bringing Danny by on Saturdays regularly. Not just the occasional visit. A standing thing. A real piece of both their weeks. I told her, of course, I'd like nothing better. I meant every word of it. Something in her shoulders eased in a way I hadn't seen since long before Preston Vance ever sat at our table calling me a legacy vote. Danny ran his fingers along the plate the way I'd shown him, closed his eyes, listened. "I think this one's good, Grandpa," he said. When I checked it against the gauge, he was right. Dead on, first try. I told him that was the whole trade, right there in one sentence. Listen carefully enough, long enough, and the truth tells you what it is before anybody has to argue about it. I stood there in that fading light, my grandson's hand still resting on a piece of true metal. My daughter easing back into a doorway she'd once stopped walking through at all. I thought about Ruth, about the letter she'd left me 11 years before any of this happened, telling me to be exact and to be fair, and to leave a door standing. I had done all three. The door Joanne walked back through wasn't one I'd forced open for her. It was one I'd simply never let anybody nail shut. Not even in the months I had every reason to want it sealed for good. I never threw a punch in this whole business. I never raised my voice. Not once. Not at Preston. Not at my son. Not at my daughter. Not even alone in my truck in that parking lot. The night I first heard Preston's voice cracking over a phone call he thought nobody could hear, the only tools I ever used were patience, and a tolerance gauge, and a piece of paper that had been sitting quietly in a filing cabinet in Pittsburgh since before Preston Vance ever proposed to my daughter. I built a company with my hands. I protected it with the truth, laid flat on a table, in front of everyone who needed to see it, at the one moment it would matter most. I stopped holding up a roof I'd been holding up alone for 2 years. It came down, quiet and complete, on the one man standing directly beneath it, the one man who'd never once bothered to check whether it was his to stand under in the first place. That's the whole of it, start to finish, exactly the way it happened. That's what happened when my son-in-law fired me from the company I founded, certain my thinking had finally slowed down past the point of mattering. He forgot, the whole time, whose name was actually on the patents. I never did. I never once forgot. If there's one thing I'd want a younger man to carry away from all this, it's not about patents, or trusts, or even about in-laws who think an old man's mind has gone soft. It's simpler than that. Protect what your hands build quietly, long before anybody gives you a reason to think you'll need to. Do it the boring way, the careful way. Years ahead of the day it might matter. And when that day finally comes, if it comes at all, you won't need to raise your voice either. You'll just need to be the only one in the room who already checked the tolerance, years before anybody else in that room thought to ask whether checking was necessary at all.